Evelyn Evie Reed had only two tasks left before nightfall descended upon the Pandora Rim. Recheck the animal traps around the settlement and ensure the water filtration system was still running smoothly. Life as a retired ranger on this remote border planet was far from the romanticized tales found in space travel journals. It was raw, harsh, and bone-chillingly lonely. Evie had chosen Pandora as her refuge, a barren world with a blood-red sky and jagged mountain ranges jutting out like dragon's teeth. Here, far from the glittering cities, suffocating regulations, and haunting memories of battles past, Evie hoped to find a final peace. But Pandora, much like her own life, wasn't about to easily grant anyone respite. As Evie finished checking the traps and returned towards her small settlement, darkness began to creep from the mountain gorges. The settlement, merely a handful of hastily assembled wooden cabins, nestled in a narrow valley, surrounded by a weak energy fence, enough to deter indigenous wildlife, but utterly hopeless against any greater threat. Dim yellow lights spilled from the kitchen window, where a fire still crackled, promising a meager supper and a long, silent night. But the silence Evie longed for was not to be. Just as she stepped onto the wooden porch, a strange, piercing sound tore through Pandora's tranquil air. Not the roar of a beast, nor the wind whistling through the mountain passes. Instead, it was a mechanical sound, rhythmic and ominous, echoing from the reddening, darkening sky. Evie froze instantly, every sense on high alert. Years of combat experience screamed that this was no ordinary sound. It carried aggression, invasion, and something chillingly cold and emotionless. She looked up, through the encroaching darkness, and her heart clenched. Against the blood-red sky, tiny black dots gradually materialized, growing larger, rapidly transforming into colossal, grotesque shapes. Warships, unmistakable, angular, black, and emitting that eerie mechanical drone, they descended from orbit like giant vultures circling carrion. Not just one or two, but dozens, hundreds, blotting out the Pandora sky. What the hell is this? Evie muttered, her voice strained with shock and a dawning dread. She had fought in countless battles, faced humanity's most brutal foes, but never, not once, had she witnessed an invasion of such scale and overwhelming force. Then, without waiting for Evie to speculate further, the warships acted. From the bellies of these metal behemoths, a barrage of searing blue beams ripped through the night, plunging towards the small settlement like blades of death. The flimsy energy fence dissolved like soap bubbles under the initial assault. The rickety wooden cabins shuddered violently, then erupted in fireballs, pillars of smoke reaching for the heavens. Ear-splitting explosions, the terrified screams of her neighbors, the collapsing structures, all blended into a symphony of death, engulfing the already desolate Pandora. Evie dropped to her knees, taking cover behind a large boulder, her heart hammering in her chest. She knew this wasn't just an attack. This was annihilation. In the flickering firelight, Evie glimpsed bizarre shapes disembarking from the ships. Not human. Tall creatures with rigid exoskeletons like armor, moving with clacking steps, emitting a chilling creaking sound. Their heads were triangular, with bulging red eyes like hot coals, and long, grotesque tentacles writhing around their mouths. Zargonians. The infamous insectoid race, notorious for their brutal conquests, slave concentration camps, and horrific biological experiments, rulers of a vast galactic empire. No way, Evie whispered, her eyes wide with horror. Why would the Zargonians target a small, impoverished settlement like Pandora? It possessed no valuable resources, no strategic importance. Unless, a chilling thought, cold as ice, flashed through Evie's mind. Not resources, not position, but humans. The Zargonians hadn't come to Pandora to plunder. They had come to take people. And Evie, unlucky soul, was one of those destined to be taken. Before she could react, before she could even reach for her trusty rifle, a searing blue energy net suddenly descended from above, binding her body, hoisting her into the air like a puppet. Evie struggled, screamed, trying to tear at the invisible net, but it was futile. Zargonian technology was far beyond the strength of a human, even a seasoned ranger like her. In the final moment before being hauled aboard the monstrous ship, Evie glanced back at the settlement engulfed in flames, at her beloved neighbors falling under Zargonian fire. And in her burning gaze, she swore to herself, even if it cost her life, she would make these invaders pay. Humanity is not prey. Humanity is something they should never have touched. The first thing Evie felt as consciousness returned was cold. Not the bone-chilling cold of Pandora nights, but a sterile, artificial cold, as if she lay on a granite slab in a morgue. Next came the pain, a throbbing ache all over her body, from head to toe, as if every cell was being crushed, twisted. Her head buzzed like a shattered beehive, and her stomach clenched in spasms. Her eyelids were heavy as lead, but discomfort and survival instinct urged her to open them. Blinding, searing white light flooded her senses, forcing her to squint for a moment to adjust. As her vision stabilized, Evie realized she was lying on a narrow, hard, cold metal table. Around her was a stark white space, soulless, with smooth, seamless walls and bizarre machinery emitting a steady hum. No windows, no furniture, no sign of life, except for herself. "Where am I?" Evie muttered, her voice hoarse with dryness. She tried to sit up, but her body resisted every effort. Her joints were stiff, muscles aching, and a wave of dizziness washed over her, nearly sending her tumbling to the floor. She realized she was naked, completely unclothed, in this cold, alien space. Humiliation and anger surged within her, but fear, even greater, suffocated every other emotion. Evie struggled to sit upright, leaning against the edge of the table. She looked around more carefully. The room was square, quite spacious, but completely empty. White light came from luminescent panels on the ceiling, shadowless, depthless, making the space even more flat and unnerving. No visible doors, just smooth metal walls, and small grooves running along the floor, perhaps for drainage or wiring. In one corner of the room, she noticed a peculiar device, resembling a tall metal column, with a tangle of pipes and cables. A small screen attached to the column flickered with incomprehensible symbols and glyphs. Occasionally, the device emitted a deep hum, causing the floor to vibrate slightly. Evie didn't know what it was, but instinct told her it boded ill. She tried to move her limbs again, this time a bit easier. Her joints were less stiff, and her muscles gradually recovering. However, she still felt incredibly weak and sluggish. Perhaps the Zargonians had injected her with something to weaken her resistance. Damn insectoid bastards. Evie gritted her teeth, her resentment growing stronger. But resentment alone was not enough. Evie knew she had to act, to find a way out of this sterile prison and avenge those who had fallen. But first, she needed to understand the situation, to know where she was, what the Zargonians wanted, and what her chances of escape were. Evie slowly slid her legs off the table, stood up straight. This time, the dizziness had subsided, but her legs still trembled. She took tentative steps, moving towards the strange device in the corner. As she approached, she could see its details more clearly. The pipes and cables were not just tangled outside, but vanished into the wall, as if the device was an inseparable part of the entire structure. The small screen still flickered, displaying lines of text and images she couldn't decipher. Suddenly, one of the smooth walls in front of Evie shimmered. A luminous outline appeared, then gradually widened, revealing a dark passageway. A shrill, piercing voice echoed in the space, in an alien language, but somehow Evie understood its meaning. Subject 743, Proceed to processing area. Subject 743. Evie muttered, wondering if that was her prisoner designation. Processing area? Processing what? A growing sense of foreboding urged her to find out what was happening. She took a deep breath, regained her composure, and stepped into the dark passageway, forward, into the dangers and mysteries that awaited. She knew this was just the beginning of a brutal survival fight, and she, Sergeant Evelyn Reed, would not give up easily. Never. The dark passageway swallowed Evie, leaving behind the sterile, cold room. Thick darkness enveloped her, with only faint streaks of light seeping from cracks in the ceiling, barely enough for her to dimly discern the corridor ahead. It was narrow and long, the metal walls rough, damp, unlike the smooth exterior of the cell. The air was stuffy, reeking of machine oil and a foul, indescribable stench, making it hard for Evie to breathe. The Zargonian hum from the device in the cell still echoed behind, but now it mingled with other sounds, more complex and ominous. The clacking of footsteps ahead, the grinding of machinery, the clash of metal, and faint whimpers, cries echoing from somewhere in the darkness. Evie shuddered. This processing area did not sound pleasant at all. She proceeded cautiously, hands outstretched, feeling her way. The corridor seemed to slope downwards, and the further she went, the heavier and more suffocating the air became. Light from ceiling cracks grew sparser, darkness thickening, becoming frightening. Evie felt like she was lost in an underground tunnel where sunlight never reached. Finally, the corridor widened, leading to a larger space, illuminated by lurid green fluorescent lights hanging overhead. This was truly the processing area. A colossal factory floor, swarming with bizarre machinery, tangled cables, and blurry figures moving about. The foul stench became overpowering, mixed with the smell of burnt metal and a nauseating chemical odor. Deafening noise assaulted her ears, drowning out all other sounds. Evie froze at the entrance to the corridor, horrified as she surveyed the scene before her. The factory floor was divided into several zones, each with different machinery and processes. In the nearest zone, massive robotic arms were operating on human bodies, or at least, things that had once been human. Naked, motionless, these bodies were attached to machines, implanted with metal components, injected with vile blue liquids, and irradiated by strange beams of light. The whimpers, cries Evie had heard earlier turned out to be the pain-filled moans of these processing subjects. Their faces were contorted, distorted, eyes rolled back, bodies convulsing violently. Yet, none of the Zargonian technicians in armor suits around them paid heed to their suffering. They focused solely on their work, operating machinery coldly and impassively, as if working on machines, not living beings. Further away, Evie saw subjects that had completed processing. They were no longer human. Their bodies were completely transformed, a blend of flesh and machine, organic and metal. These cyborgs moved mechanically, soullessly, lining up to await further stages. Some were placed on conveyor belts, entering dark tunnels. Others were gathered into groups, led away by Zargonian guards, perhaps to somewhere else. Evie realized with horror what this processing area was. This was no ordinary prisoner holding area. This was a factory turning humans into cyborg slaves. Project Assimilation, which she had vaguely heard mentioned before being captured, turned out to be something this horrific. The Zargonians not only wanted to enslave other races, they wanted to erase identity, transform them into mindless tools, serving their expansionist ambitions. Anger and resentment within Evie exploded more fiercely than ever. She clenched her fists, fingernails digging into her palms. She had to stop this. She couldn't allow herself, and others, to be turned into such soulless monsters. She had to escape and warn the entire galaxy about the Zargonian Alliance's brutality. But how? This factory floor was too vast, too many guards, and machinery too advanced. Evie, alone, naked, unarmed, how could she fight against such a colossal war machine? Despair flickered in her mind, but was quickly extinguished by a ranger's indomitable will. Never surrender. Never give up. Evie took a deep breath, trying to regain composure. She knew she couldn't rush into a direct attack. She needed to observe, gather information, look for weaknesses, and wait for an opportunity. She began to move along the corridor, hugging the wall, trying to blend into the shadows, avoiding the gaze of Zargonian guards. She needed to find out how this area was organized. Were there any escape routes? And was there anyone here who could help her? While moving, Evie glanced at the processing subjects being tortured on the machines. Suddenly, her gaze froze on a familiar figure. A woman with matted, sweat and blood-soaked blonde hair, lying motionless on an examination table. Though her face was distorted with pain, Evie still recognized her. It was Sarah, one of her neighbors from the Pandora settlement. Evie's heart clenched. Sarah was still alive. But she was here, in this hellish factory, about to be turned into a cyborg slave. Evie couldn't abandon Sarah. She had to save her. And save all the others, too. A bold idea flashed in Evie's mind. A reckless, almost suicidal plan, but perhaps her only chance. She would pretend to be a processing subject, blend into the crowd, and find a way to reach Sarah. And from there, she would begin her rebellion. Evie's plan was insane, undeniably. Pretending to be a processing subject among hundreds, thousands of prisoners awaiting cyborg assimilation, naked, unarmed, in a factory teeming with enemy guards and machinery? The odds of success were almost zero. But Evie had no other choice. Sitting idly waiting for death was not a ranger's style. She took a deep breath, swallowing the fear and revulsion rising within her. She began to act. First, she needed to look like a processing subject. That meant eliminating any sign that she was a soldier, a person still with consciousness and strength. She hunched over, bowed her head, deliberately adopting a weak, resigned posture. She relaxed her body, letting fatigue and pain take over, trying to blend into the surrounding brokenness. Then, she started moving. She merged into the stream of prisoners shuffling along the corridor, trying to move in the direction where she had seen Sarah earlier. She walked slowly, eyes darting around, noting guard positions, routes, and especially Sarah's location. The factory floor was larger and more complex than she'd imagined, with hundreds of passageways, thousands of machines, and countless prisoners from all races. The stench and deafening noise made her feel dizzy and disoriented. Evie tried to ignore the soulless gazes of the prisoners around her. They were pitiful creatures, stripped of everything, both identity and will. Some staggered like living corpses. Others sat slumped on the floor, heads in hands, whimpering. No one spoke. No one looked at anyone, all submerged in despair and resignation. Looking at them, Evie's heart clenched. She couldn't let them continue to endure this hell. She had to liberate them. But first, she had to find Sarah. Evie continued weaving through the crowd, relying on memory and instinct to find her way. She passed through noisy machine zones, dark corridors, and horrific processing areas where prisoners were being tortured on machines. Every step was a risk, every moment a test. She knew that one slip, she could be discovered and eliminated instantly. Finally, after a long and tense journey, Evie reached the area where she had seen Sarah earlier. This was an examination zone, with dozens of metal tables lined up in long rows. On each table, a prisoner lay motionless, body naked, connected to countless cables and tubes. Cold robotic arms moved over their bodies, performing gruesome surgeries. Evie scanned table after table, her heart pounding in her chest. And then, she saw Sarah. She was still there, on the table at the end of the row, body motionless, blonde hair matted with blood and sweat. She looked weaker and more gaunt than the last time Evie had seen her in the Pandora settlement. A choking sorrow surged within Evie. She had to save Sarah at all costs. Evie approached Sarah's table, trying to maintain a calm and emotionless facade. She glanced around, making sure no guards were paying attention to her. When close enough, she leaned down, pressed her ear to Sarah's lips, and whispered, voice hoarse, "Sarah? Sarah, it's me, Evie. Can you hear me?" Sarah didn't react. Her eyes were tightly closed, her face pale, her breathing shallow. Evie worriedly shook her shoulder gently. "Sarah, please answer me." Still no response. Evie began to feel desperate. Perhaps Sarah was too weak or had been rendered unconscious by the Zargonians. But Evie didn't give up. She continued to shake Sarah gently, calling her name, and trying to transmit to her a sliver of hope, a spark of strength. And then, a miracle happened. Sarah's eyelids fluttered slightly. She slowly opened her eyes, her vacant gray-blue gaze fixing on Evie. It took a moment, her gaze refocusing, recognizing the person in front of her. Evie, Sarah whispered, her voice as faint as a breath. Is that you?" "It's me, Sarah," Evie replied, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'm here to save you. Can you stand up?" Sarah weakly shook her head. "I can't feel anything." Her voice broke, strained. "Well, what did they do to me?" "I don't have time to explain now," Evie said quickly. "Listen, Sarah, I'm going to get you out of here. But you have to trust me, and you have to do as I say. Do you agree?" Sarah looked at Evie, a faint spark of hope flickering in her eyes. She nodded, a small nod, but full of resolve. "I trust you." Just then, a shrill, piercing voice echoed from behind Evie. Subject 743 and 744, assimilation process phase 1 will commence in 5 minutes. Preparation required. Evie spun around, startled. A tall Zargonian guard, in black armor, stood right behind her, energy rifle pointed directly at her. Its red eyes stared intently at Evie, devoid of emotion. And Evie knew her time was up. 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes until assimilation process phase 1 commenced. 5 minutes for Evie to decide her fate, Sarah's fate, and perhaps the fate of all the prisoners imprisoned in this earthly hell. Time was running out, and options were incredibly limited. Evie stared directly into the red eyes of the Zargonian guard, trying to conceal the panic surging within her. She knew that a direct confrontation with this fully armed guard was suicide. She needed to think fast, find an escape route, a weakness, anything that could help her survive and save Sarah. But first, she needed to distract the guard, buy time, and prevent it from alerting its comrades. Evie decided to take a risk, relying on the only advantage she had, surprise. She pretended to slump down, clutching her stomach, moaning, feigning pain and weakness. I feel unwell," she groaned, her voice breaking, deliberately sounding as pathetic as possible. Please, help me." The Zargonian guard paused, seeming slightly confused by Evie's unexpected action. It tilted its head, the tentacles around its mouth wriggling incomprehensibly. Perhaps the Zargonians were not accustomed to their prisoners feeling unwell before being assimilated. They only viewed prisoners as machines, nothing more. Subject 743. The guard rasped, its voice mechanical. "System malfunction? Analyze status." It began to approach Evie, a small robotic arm on its armor extending, seemingly preparing to scan her biometrics. This was Evie's chance. In the moment the guard lost focus, Evie sprang up like a hunting panther. The speed and strength of a ranger burst forth, shattering the feigned weakness she had just created. She lunged at the guard with terrifying speed, dodging the outstretched robotic arm, and delivered a monotonously lightning-fast kick to its knee joint. Crack! A bone-jarring snap echoed. The Zargonian exoskeleton might be durable, but its knee joint was not. The guard shrieked in a piercing, ear-splitting wail, collapsing in pain. Evie didn't give it a chance to recover. She swung her arm, snatched the energy rifle from its grasp, and followed up with a thunderous punch to its head. Thud! A loud thud echoed as the guard's head collided with the examination table. It crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Evie gasped for breath, quickly picking up the energy rifle. It was heavy and alien, but at least she had a weapon in hand. And more than that, she had just defeated a Zargonian guard, proving that these insectoids were not invincible. Sarah. Evie turned back to Sarah, her voice urgent. We have to go now? There's no time left. Sarah was still weak, but had regained some mobility. She struggled to sit up, leaning on the edge of the table. I can walk, she whispered, her voice trembling, but her eyes now showing a hint of determination. Evie didn't wait for Sarah to stand on her own. She wrapped her arm around Sarah, helping her up, and guided her away from the examination table. Energy rifle clutched firmly in her hand. Evie warily scanned her surroundings, searching for an escape route. She knew that the commotion might have already alerted other guards. The Zargonians would not let this slide easily. Follow me, Evie whispered to Sarah, her voice resolute. We're getting out of here. Together. And then, Evie began her breathless escape, leading the weakened Sarah through the maze of the Cyborg factory, facing countless dangers and challenges. She knew that the odds of success were slim, but she would not allow herself to falter. For Sarah, for the other innocent prisoners, and for all of humanity, Evie would fight to the end. HFY. Humanity, fuck yeah. Humanity, strongest in the galaxy. This motto echoed in her mind, fueling the courage and resolve of the female ranger. Undeterred by the enemy's overwhelming numbers, Evie tightened her grip on the energy rifle, assuming a stance ready for battle. She was no longer a lone warrior. She had Sarah behind her, and the will of thousands of prisoners awaiting liberation. That fueled her with unwavering strength and resolve. The Zargonian guards advanced, forming a line, their energy rifles all pointed at Evie. They didn't rush to attack, but paused a few meters away, observing and assessing the situation. Perhaps they were still surprised that a prisoner dared to stand up and fight back. Or perhaps they were waiting for reinforcements to arrive. But Evie didn't give them time to ponder. She knew that waiting would only worsen their situation. A preemptive strike, seizing the initiative, that was a ranger's tactic. And it was also her only way to survive. HFY. Evie roared, humanity's familiar battle cry, the shout tearing through the tense atmosphere. At the same time, she lunged forward, lightning fast, energy rifle firing. A searing blue energy beam ripped through the air, slamming straight into the chest of the lead guard. Boom! A small explosion erupted. The Zargonian's armor was ripped open, revealing the soft, fleshy tissue beneath. The guard collapsed to the floor, motionless. Evie's surprise and powerful attack had disrupted the guard formation. They recoiled, shouting in their shrill alien tongue. But Evie didn't stop there. She continued to surge forward, moving with agility and speed, exploiting the enemy's confusion to attack relentlessly. The energy rifle in her hands fired nonstop, each energy beam taking a Zargonian life. Evie moved like a whirlwind, weaving through the guard formation, dodging their attacks, and counterattacking brutally and effectively. Years of combat experience, lightning-fast reflexes, and expert weapon skills of a ranger helped Evie gain the upper hand in this uneven battle. She knew how to utilize terrain, how to strike at enemy weaknesses, and how to maintain unwavering focus and resolve in any situation. The Zargonian guards, though greater in number and equipped with advanced weapons, were completely passive and surprised by Evie's bold and unpredictable attacks. They were accustomed to overwhelming opponents with numbers and firepower, not to close-quarters combat, speed, and high-skill techniques like this. Their clumsiness and lack of coordination became fatal weaknesses, making them easy targets for Evie. In just a blink, Evie had taken down nearly half of the Zargonian guards. The fallen bodies lay scattered on the floor, smoking and reeking of burnt metal and flesh. The remaining guards began to truly panic. They retreated, firing wildly, trying to maintain a safe distance from Evie. But it was too late. The tide of battle had completely turned. "Sarah, let's go," Evie yelled, signaling Sarah to follow. She knew that, although she had defeated one squad of guards, it was just the beginning. The Zargonians would surely deploy more troops, and the situation would become increasingly dangerous. She needed to leave this area quickly, find safe shelter, and plan her next move. Sarah, though still weak, had regained some strength thanks to adrenaline and exhilaration from Evie's victory. She struggled to her feet, running after Evie, the energy rifle Evie had just given her trembling in her hands. The two women, one strong and decisive, one weak but resilient, fled the earthly hell together, heading forward, seeking hope and freedom in the murky darkness. But could they escape successfully? Could they withstand the overwhelming power of the Zargonian alliance? And could the spark of rebellion Evie had just ignited blaze into a large flame, incinerating the yoke of slavery of these insectoids? All remained unknown. But one thing was certain: Evie Reed would never give up, never yield. The HFY, humanity, fuck yeah, spirit still burned brightly in her heart, guiding her path in the arduous and challenging fight for survival ahead. The victory against the first squad of guards was just a small spark in the pitch-black night. Evie knew this clearly. The Zargonians would not let her and Sarah escape easily. They would hunt them relentlessly, mobilizing all forces to extinguish the nascent seeds of rebellion. Time was running out, and every passing moment could determine their lives. "Faster," Evie urged Sarah, pulling her along the corridor. The two women dashed through the darkness, the echo of their hurried footsteps resounding in the silent space. Evie led the way, relying on a mental map in her head and instinct to find an escape route. She knew their immediate goal was not only to escape this processing area, but also to get out of the entire colossal cyborg factory, and further still, the Zargonian mothership hovering in Pandora's orbit. But how to achieve those almost impossible goals? Evie had no answer yet. She only knew she had to keep fighting, keep moving, and hope for the unexpected. Hope, sometimes, was the most powerful weapon humans possessed, especially in the most desperate situations. While fleeing, Evie suddenly realized something. The corridor they were now in wasn't like the sterile, cold corridors she had seen before. It was narrower, older, and seemed less used. The walls were no longer smooth, but rough, uneven, with cracks and patches of moss. The lighting was also dimmer, just flickering from old lamps hanging on the ceiling. "Where are we going?" Sarah panted, her voice weak. "This doesn't look like the factory area." "I'm not sure either," Evie replied, her eyes darting around, observing their surroundings. "But perhaps this is an older, less controlled area. Maybe we can find an escape route here." As she spoke, Evie pushed open a rusty metal door, leading into a small, dark room. The room was empty, save for a few old crates and a messy workbench. Dust covered everything, indicating this place had been abandoned for a long time. But Evie felt a spark of hope ignite within her. Abandoned area, meaning fewer guards, fewer surveillance cameras, and perhaps more opportunities to hide and seek an escape. "We'll take a break here," Evie said, helping Sarah to sit down on a crate. "You need to rest." She observed Sarah, noticing her face was still pale and tired, but her eyes had brightened slightly. "How are you feeling?" "Better, a bit," Sarah replied, her voice still weak, but with more life than before. "Thank you." "Evie, don't mention it." Evie smiled gently. "We'll get through this together." She handed Sarah the energy rifle she had taken from the guard. "You take this. I'll search around, see if there's anything useful." Evie began exploring the room. She rummaged through the old crates, checked the messy workbench, and carefully examined the walls and ceiling. Most everything was useless, just dust and junk. But as she checked the workbench, Evie suddenly noticed something that caught her attention. An old tablet, tucked under a stack of decaying papers. "Look at this," Evie exclaimed, picking up the tablet. "Maybe this is what we need." She brushed dust off the screen and pressed the power button. The screen flickered for a moment, then lit up, displaying a strange graphical interface with incomprehensible Zargonian symbols and glyphs. "Do you know how to use this?" Sarah asked, curiously eyeing the tablet. "No," Evie shook her head, "but I know someone who might be able to help us." She remembered the computer and tech skills she had been trained in during her ranger service. She wasn't a professional hacker, but she knew the basics, and she believed, with some tinkering and patience, she could decipher this tablet. Evie began fiddling with the tablet, experimenting with buttons and icons on the screen. The Zargonian interface was quite complex and confusing, but Evie didn't give up. She tried method after method, relying on her intuition and experience to find a clue. And then, after some fumbling, she suddenly found a familiar icon. An icon of a globe, with the words "Area Map" below it. "Bingo!" Evie exclaimed, tapping the icon. The tablet screen instantly switched to a map interface, displaying a detailed schematic of the entire Cyborg factory area. Passageways, rooms, machinery areas, and even the locations of guards and surveillance cameras. All were clearly displayed on the map. "Unbelievable," Sarah gasped in amazement. We have a map of the factory?" "Exactly," Evie grinned, her eyes gleaming with hope. "This is exactly what we need. With this map, we can find an escape route, avoid guards, and even, maybe sabotage this whole factory." A bold idea flashed in Evie's mind. If she could use this tablet to access the factory's control system, she could do more than just escape. She could liberate all the prisoners and spark a real rebellion. "But, do you know how to use it?" Sarah was still slightly doubtful. "It's all alien writing. I'll learn," Evie replied, her voice full of determination. "I'm human, after all. We can learn anything, adapt to any environment, and overcome any challenge. Humanity, fuck yeah. You believe me, Sarah?" Sarah looked at Evie, a glimmer of faith and admiration in her gray-blue eyes. She nodded, a faint smile appearing on her lips. "I believe you, Evie. I believe we can do it." And then, the two women, with an old tablet and an energy rifle, began to sketch out their rebellion plan. They knew the road ahead was still long and fraught with danger, but in their hearts, a flame of hope had ignited. That flame would light their way, break through the darkness, and bring freedom to all those who were oppressed. The fight had only just begun.